So, about a year ago, I had an idea for a book that I wanted to write. It would have been, essentially, a synthesis of different ideas taken from permaculture, deep ecology, environmental justice, some Stemetian musings about mushrooms, indigenous movements, radical ecology, agroecology, decolonization, postmodern ecological theory, etc., and would have served as my environmental manifesto. It would have been my vision for an updated form of social justice politics that sees ecosystems as being at the heart of every issue, and treats every issue as an ecosystem. Deeply holistic and necessarily modest in its epistemology, I've been operating under these theories for years now, so I wanted to share them. But then I remembered that if I wrote a book, it would probably get rejected by a bunch of publishers, and it'd be a long, shitty slog, and then in the end, probably wouldn't reach as many people as I wanted it to. So, instead, I decided to start this YouTube channel. This channel and these videos are essentially what would have been that book, but hopefully presented in a more engaging and interesting way. It also makes it easier for me to integrate my music. My project here is ambitious. To do no less than to present a comprehensive alternative to the extractive, neoliberal, colonial capitalism that has been all of our heritage. Because, why not? It's not like things are going well. To help sow the ideological seeds that one can only hope will someday grow into a mighty tree of compassion, love for yourself, love for each other, and for the all-embracing biosphere that we call home. So, I'm here to invite you to join me in casting off those mind chains that disown and separate you from the ecologies that you depend on, that entice you to look out into the vast mystical wonder of creation and see it as the other, not just as another reflection of yourself. So, in this video, we'll be discussing the base principles of this enhanced ecological consciousness, which I have dubbed Compost Modernism. When I was an undergrad, I took a class on ecological anthropology, and we would get into these discussions about what nature was. Like, how would you define it? Where did it end? We recognized that humans perceiving themselves as separate from nature was a seriously problematic view, as it had turned into a deeply encoded false dichotomy that had allowed a lot of people to justify actions that were very counterproductive to the flourishing of their own species. But then, if humans are just another part of nature, and if by extension everything that we did was natural, then what did our idea of nature and the word even mean? Is my cell phone nature? Is Burger King nature? Is fucking 4chan as much an expression of the awesome beauty of nature's creation as the Himalayas or the Grand Canyon? Following this line of thinking very quickly makes the word nature seem pretty meaningless. And maybe it is. In English, when we speak of nature, what we're often referring to is a kind of aesthetic sense that has deep roots in colonialism and white supremacy, which I discussed in my video on decolonizing your environmentalism, which you can watch. I'm still on the fence of whether or not the entire idea of nature should just be tossed out. Now, I would eventually come to realize that we are asking the wrong question. The cultural consensus around the word nature is far too static of a concept to explain the rippling infinitude that is our universe. Everything may or may not be nature, but everything is ecology, which is to say that everything is part of a system. Now, when I say ecology, I'm not only referring to the food chain diagram that you studied in high school biology, though I'm also talking about that. Essentially, we must imagine that diagram as not only being relevant to wild animals and plants, but as being an integral factor in the lives of all living things, extending all the way to the minds of us humans. My definition and understanding of ecology is not only related to the material aspects of energy flows through living beings. It extends to the very social makeup of our society, and, as I hope to demonstrate to you, becomes a deeply metaphysical and, dare I say, mystical representation of reality. Thus, to see things from an ecological point of view is to see things as they are, deeply connected, inextricable, inalienable from each other, deeply dependent on one another, deeply damaged, and yet immortal. Everything living on this planet, either human or non-human, is the result of a bewilderingly complex cascade of ecological events that thrusts forward into time, fractalizing outward and feeding back into itself. Put simply, the way that I see the world is that the very same patterns that occur in nature and that dictate the energetic flows of ecological systems govern all the complexities of the human sphere of existence as much as they do the non-human. But aruga, caution, aruga. Cherry-picking examples from nature and then using them to justify some motivated reasoning for a particular worldview is a very slippery slope. Think the myth of the alpha male wolf and JPP's lobsters. I posit that using individual examples of individual interactions, i.e. Geordie Boy's lobsters, in order to draw some grand conclusion about the nature of humanity is foolish and dumb. Because you're literally just cherry-picking and ignoring every single contradictory example in creation. An ecological point of view requires one to take every aspect of the system into account, even the elements and dynamics that you might not yet be aware of. So, if you find yourself cherry-picking from nature as a reason to be an asshole to women, you're doing it wrong. These ideas are far from new. In fact, they're demonstrably ancient. The ancient world is rich with different animistic religions that literally worshipped the life-giving deities that resided in the landscape. Such beliefs are still upheld in many parts of the world. Indigenous European religions syncretized some of these ideas into Christianity. The Enlightenment, however, not coincidentally occurring around the same time as the apex of the colonial age, discouraged such mystical, deeply ecological thinking, instead demanding that we be purely rational beings, and that the myriad aspects of human intellect are best expressed by aristocratic racists wearing dumb wigs and opining loudly about things that they were often very totally wrong about. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
On the climate change issue, I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in reading the studies. I do know that certain aspects that have been widely talked about have been debunked. The idea that the Arctic ice is disappearing is nonsense.
One of the biggest lies of the Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment, have the capacity and the moral imperative to liberate ourselves from nature by doing away with silly belief systems that mystify and revere the ecological. Then we're totally free to cut down the rainforest and convert it all into cold, hard cash, yo. Because everyone knows that the only value that forest has is the price that it can fetch me on the free market, baby. Woohoo! Cash flow, let's go. Caveat alert, caveat alert. Now, this is obviously a brief caricature and not completely fair version of this history, but critiquing the Enlightenment is like a whole can of worms that really just deserves its own video. Also, when I critique the Enlightenment, I'm not saying that the scientific method is bad or that everything that came out of the Enlightenment is bad. As a thinker, I do my best to try to shy away from making such blanket statements about histories that contain so much nuance. For the record, I am pro-science and the scientific method. I think that science is cool as fuck, and I trust and believe experts when they do their expert thing. My only stipulation is that practitioners of science remain modest in their approach, and that they understand that the scientific method is one among many of different ways of understanding and learning about the world, and that science not necessarily be seen as the highest, purest form of human knowledge. Basically, if you're practicing the scientific method, you must also be aware of the ways that your ideas about your work may be descended from and potentially perpetuating colonialist paradigms. Now, go ahead and debate that one in the comments. There's a lot that I won't get around to covering in this video, as this ecological view of the world is a theory that has a lot of nuance and a lot of different thinkers behind it. So, do you want to learn more about how a meta-ecological POV will change how you see the world? Then like and subscribe, baby! In more recent times, and amid the sphere of European-descended intellectual traditions, ideologies that seek to return to a more ecologically based worldview have been expressed in ideas such as the Gaia hypothesis, permaculture, and theories such as deep ecology. And this is to say nothing of the rich wisdom of the many different indigenous, non-European versions of these ideas that have long existed outside the realm of white men who are convinced that they know better. Suffice to say that the intellectual tradition of this worldview as an energetic ecology as a first principle for understanding and critiquing the panoply of fucked up dynamics that we modern humans partake in has been richly expressed by cultures the world over. And this is a topic which I fully intend to explore elsewhere on this channel. So like and subscribe. Now, following this unnecessarily long and verbose prologue, we will be getting into some of the first principles of our Compost Modernism Manifesto. And with that, let us offer our bodies, our minds, our sins, and our innocence to the myceliated compost lords. Whoa! 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 wow, finally someone wants to talk about soil. Did you guys know that topsoil takes hundreds of years to form and is rapidly disappearing across the world? Also, healthy topsoil is extremely important for human civilization, and it's comprised of an infinity of interactions between different tiny little creatures, many of which we don't even fully understand. Hey, you guys seem really amped up about soil. Maybe you want to come over later and make some biochar with me? Or maybe check out my new compost tea brewer. The Jews, that doesn't have anything to do with soil. I'm beginning to feel like you guys don't actually care about the soil. When I had all these ideas to write this book, I somehow hadn't read this one. So when I read this one a few months ago, I got to have the experience of thinking that I had a great idea for a book, and then realized that somebody else had already written a very similar book a long time ago in a way that is probably way better articulated than anything that I would have produced. A Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold is one of the seminal works of colonialist American environmentalist thought. And to me, the central premise of it boils down to one simple phrase. If it's good for the land, then it's good for the people. By the land, we mean everything that lives on it, from the soil microbes to the trees to the animals. Because land and a biotic community are just that, a community. Despite all of our rugged individual, libertarian, wet dream fantasy delusions, no living creature exists without an entire ecosystem to support it. And so, just like communities of soil microbes, human communities also exist in this way. And we, unlike many other creatures, can choose to live in symbiosis with the soil and the land, or we can choose to act like a disease upon it, sucking it dry until its death results in our own. To Leopold, this simple premise should be converted into a code of ethics, as he explains. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And the biotic community includes humans. Therefore, there's a more subtle point to this thesis, and it's something that we humans, especially us Americans, are exceptionally bad at. That is, we need to extend our sense of self to beyond just me. To see ourselves as lone actors whose actions and beliefs are not inextricably tied up with the ecological realities of the soil, water, and land is one of the greatest intellectual fallacies that the human mind has ever produced. As extremely complex products of photosynthesis, as animate matter fueled by the power of the sun, who will one day return to the dusty anonymity of the soil, we must keep our minds fixed to the very thing that has supported human civilization and so many other living creatures. The land is the center of the community, because the land gives life. If everyone only takes from the community and never gives back, then soon the community will be impoverished. And humans need community. We evolved to need it. So, love the land like you love yourself, like you love your family, and like you love your community, because it is all of those things. But, big ol' caution here. We must be careful in our analysis of these values to not fall into what I call the computer brain fallacy. I've heard other people imagine a scenario where we create some AI and then tell it to fix the environmental crisis, and then gave it all the data that it needs, and then it determines that the best way to solve the problem would just be to go full Terminator mode on all humans. The computer, in that situation, obviously would be kind of right. But this brings us to another important facet of a truly ecological or compost modern point of view. If we accept that all living creatures are participants in and products of ecology, then that means that humans are just as ecologically bound as squirrels or trees. Therefore, we are the ecology looking back at itself. We are facets of it that have somehow gained the ability to introspect and be self-aware, but we are still bound to it. We are the ecology learning about itself, looking at itself. However, despite all of our intellectual gifts as big-brained monkeys, we must always be aware of the fact that our perspective is limited by our myopia, that there is always something about the ecology that we don't know. Because we are only one little piece of the system learning about itself, we are inherently limited by our senses and our minds. Thus, we are incapable of seeing the system from any perspective except from that of an emotional, subjective human. And that's a good thing. If someone tells you that they're totally objective and they never allow their human perspective to interfere with their judgments, they're either lying to you or they're sketchy AF. Don't trust them. Ergo, humanism and the need to return the human mind to a place of reverence and respect for the ecologies that bind us must be a central tenet of this theory. It is the perversions of the human mind that have done so much damage to the ecological community. And we must liberate ourselves and each other from it if we hope to gain a higher level of ecological awareness and integration. And in doing so, we must be careful to not fall back into the notion that we can somehow transcend or circumvent the humanness of others. Let's not all go around pretending we're some hyper-rational objective robots. That's what got us into this whole mess. This simple little idea that anything that's good for the people is good for the land is elegant in that it can be extended to politics just as much as it can be extended to your daily life. Our actions are never limited to ourselves. There are always externalities, whether or not we live to see them or experience them directly. Climate change is a result of the systemic deceit that this is not the case, that we as earthbound creatures can somehow be kept separate from the consequences of our ecological violence. An ideology that is a true climate change solution requires the reversal of this lie. It requires, on the individual human level, an intellectual and emotional expansion of our self-conception that integrates every facet and limitation of the ecology into every facet of human society. On the individual level, as well as the collective, because the individual is the collective, this means that we must remember what the base unit of all human civilization, achievement, and progress has been. It's all of this. The land. To rebuild our world and our society means that we must heal our relationship to it. We must treat each other and the land with love and respect and reverence, because we are all bound up in this net together. Doing violence to the land is merely doing violence to yourself and your people, whether or not you see it that way. If it's good for the land, then it's good for the people. If it's good for the people, then it should also be good for the land, because if it's not good for the people. Also, diversity and chaos. The authoritarian white supremacist hates these things, but the ecology loves them. The resilience of an ecosystem is very often directly proportional to the amount of diversity found within it. There's a reason that we don't find forests that look like this. Ecology, from the racket of soil bacteria and fungi, to the interaction that these creatures have with plants, to all the different trees that are growing that are covered in lichens and mosses and air plants, to all the animals that live amongst them, the biosphere is a chaotic place, and it is only the conceit of our ability to self-deceive that allows us to believe that we can define ourselves as other to the chaos. Thus, a human society that mirrors ecological systems will be dynamic and resilient and diverse and chaotic. White supremacists think that society should look like this. The racist mind sees the chaos of diversity as anathema to good white order, because chaos defies their need for hierarchy, but the ecology is not hierarchical. Even the apex predators are only as good as the maggots and the microbes that will return them to the soil once they're dead. The white nationalist fascist thinks that human society should be like a monoculture, with all undesirable species of beings stamped out and poisoned. But science and common sense have very clearly shown that monocultures are bad for everyone, for a fairly simple reason. The biosphere does not deal in monoculture. And to obtain a monoculture requires one to poison the land and the water and yourself, which I guess is pretty on brand for the fascist. Like, this even applies in simple genetic terms. Diversity in the gene pool? Good. Excessive inbreeding? Not so good. Human society should look more like this. No, wait, wrong Amazon. Like this. As a corollary to our premise here, we must remember that human diversity, just like biodiversity, is strength. Ecological interactions are infinitely complex, and each agent in the system has their own perspective, so they should all be valued. Can you not look at me? Don't just sit there and stare at me. Another backwards 0 out of 10 aspect of European adjacent spiritual thought is that transcendence is possible. This is especially true for all the fantasies that Christianity has instilled in us, that we're all here on Earth as a trial run, so then after we die we'll get to join Sky Daddy in his golden sky world, and we'll get to giggle in the clouds and play harps and togas all day. The Christianization of Europe and the slow eradication of European indigenous eco-animistic belief systems codified this ecocidal cult of skydaddyism and then turned it into a roided out colonization monster, spreading its thought poison across the world. Transcendence, in the sense that it is possible for one to shake off the consequences of your worldly actions and place yourself in a higher position to the world around you, is a crock of shit. This deception has allowed our forebears to go on believing that it doesn't matter if they spend their entire lives committing ecocide and wrecking the planet for future generations, as long as they do it in the name of Sky Daddy. But as an ecological phenomenon, transcendence does not exist. As one of the key assumptions in this paradigm of transcendence is the belief that there is such thing as absolute forms of good and evil, right and wrong, heaven and hell, Q and Killary, and that we must transcend the evil in order to obtain the good. This is a binary. And as gender has taught us very well, binaries are stupid, and they very often exist in order to deny the infinite ambiguities and complexities of this beautiful, fucked up world. But ecology does not transcend. It integrates. If we accept that ecological systems are our sacred model for living and the entire reason for our existence, we will see that they do not exist in order to transcend their inherent immorality so that they can ascend to a higher level of some arbitrary good or some such bullshit. Ecological systems, over long periods of time, trend towards balance, equilibrium, and harmony. The harmony of chaos and competition and symbiosis that results in higher levels of order and higher levels of ecological complexity. Bringing it back down to the human sphere a little bit, we can think of this in terms of an argument between two people that are in a relationship, each of whom think that they are right and the other person is wrong. They're arguing about something morally ambiguous and emotionally complicated. Their relationship is the ecology, the system that binds them together. So now, what is the point of their argument? If they're both purely fixed to the feeling that they're 100% correct and the other person is 100% wrong, then they're both operating under the assumption that they can somehow transcend their common relationship and assert their truth onto the mind of the other. If there's no willingness to compromise for the sake of the relationship, then the relationship may end. We're seeing this today in American politics. One side is obsessed with winning, to the point that they're enthusiastically backing weapons-grade caricatures of the stupidest kind of American. They would rather destroy the government than allow the other side to win fair and square. They think they can transcend history and the ties that bind us and assert their poisonous worldview onto the rest of us by sheer power of will. Their literal whole political platform is owning the libs. These people are stuck in a binary world where there is pure good and pure evil, and there are only two genders. And white people are Sky Daddy's favorite, because he's white, and he only wants us white people to vote and not anyone else, because Sky Daddy created democracy for cis straight white people. But this tendency is not only limited to the right, for it manifests itself in some of the worst behaviors of the other side of the political spectrum as well, especially when it comes to the very online corners of leftist political discourse. Now, I know that the phrase cancel culture has been so thoroughly appropriated by the bad faith brigade of the Republican Party that it makes us all die a little bit inside every time we hear the phrase, but there's a reason for that. Because, as ecological systems teach us, things don't just appear out of nowhere. I've seen time and time again, with my own two eyes, this voracious appetite to digitally behead anyone that has sinned against the orthodoxy of intersectional SJW political thought, to cast them out and forever brand them as inherently terrible, unworthy, invalid scum of the earth. I've personally known many people who have suffered this fate. But you know what happens to that person when the community has deluded itself into thinking that it has forever transcended the garbage quality soul of the person in question? That person keeps on existing. They're still physically a part of your community. The difference now is that they're angry and lonely and bitter and resentful. This approach does not bring greater balance to the larger socio-ecosystem. It might seem like that in the short term, but in the long term, it kind of does the opposite. Because humans, being deeply social creatures, need to attach themselves to a community. And when someone feels cast out and shamed and invalidated by your side, the arguments of the other side may begin to seem very persuasive and seductive. Maybe that person was not your enemy before, but now they may see you as such. If you treat those around you as your enemy, you will make them your enemy. An ecosystem is not zero-sum, because an ecosystem is composed of the interactions and relationships of many, many different individuals. There are no individual winners and losers. The only true losers are those that are so preoccupied with their egotistical notion that there is some transcendental good or evil in the world that they end up destabilizing the ecosystem to assert their delusions. So, what does integration look like? Integration looks like compost. It's messy, it's gross, it might even be a little stinky. But if done right, it makes you some dank motherfucking soil that you can grow all the best veggies in. An ecological system integrates. If there's something that isn't yet part of the system, via all of the little creatures that call it home, will find a way to integrate it into it. If an animal dies in the forest, the ecosystem doesn't go into a moral panic about how it needs to transcend the sneaky grossness of the rotting corpse. The body becomes a tiny ecological event, providing food for an infinity of creatures, both big and small. And it shares its incarnational vessel with the beings that are still living in the system. Thus, within the bounds of an ecological system, death isn't bad and death isn't final. Death is simply a transmigration of energy. Death is life. When you're making compost, you start with all the different unintegrated heterogeneous scraps. But over time, the compost digests them and integrates them all together, reducing them down to a homogeneous black mass that is fertile, fecund, and all-forgiving. The food scraps are our individual shortcomings and imperfections. The decay is the integration process. The final product is a substrate that has turned all of this invaluable waste into one of the most precious resources that we can have on this sweet little earth. Dank ass motherfucking high quality soil. To integrate is to recognize that all energies, both negative and positive, are bound up within our shared system. And if we wish to convert this chaos into something productive, then we must break it down and integrate it into the soil of the ecosystem. This concept applies equally across personal struggles, to interpersonal ones, to history, and to politics. Returning to our relationship analogy from earlier, if this theoretical couple were to prioritize the common ecology of their relationship over their individual desires to feel right, then they will both listen to the thoughts and feelings of the other person and accept that maybe there's some truth in what the other person is saying, even if it may not be immediately apparent to them, and even if they don't fully agree with them. Relating this to politics, integration means that arguments should never be seen in terms of winning and losing. Integration means that we take all of the disparate aspects of a disagreement and we accept them and deconstruct them and turn them into fertile ground for further understanding. Transcendence is a paradigm that sees waste in the system, but nature does not waste. Like, let's consider the weed. No, not that kind. A weed isn't bad. A weed tells us something about the nature and conditions of the system, as well as our own subjective values. The system is always expressing itself, and if we want to address and correct undesirable dynamics in the system, then we need to do so on the systemic level. Integration accepts all aspects of the system as the sum total of the ecology. It sees no waste in the system, and it seeks to bring greater balance to itself by composting and integrating problematic dynamics. This means not always going around and assigning binary values of good and bad to everything, like you're the self-appointed judge, jury, and executioner of the world. Let's do a relevant example. Our good friends over at QAnon. Let's see QAnon as the weed in our ecosystem, also known as the QAnondilion. Say we see a QAnondilion growing in a garden, and we say, no, bad, and we yank that shit up. But that doesn't solve the problem, because the QAnondilion has spread its seeds everywhere. We could spend the rest of our lives trying to remove every single QAnondilion from the ecosystem, but that's a fool's errand. We could go around spraying poison on all of the QAnondilions, but that'll just poison your ecosystem and breed poison-resistant weeds. Alternatively, we could seek to understand the exact ecological conditions that give rise to the QAnondilion and then amend them. Maybe the presence of this noxious weed denotes a certain nutrient imbalance in the soil, or that Facebook needs to be held accountable for strapping QAnondilion seeds to a seed-bombing drone and then bombarding all of our gardens with their bullshit. Going a little deeper, we'll see that maybe the QAnondilion is spreading in a time when more and more people are trying to find meaning in this weird-ass world, and when there's a lot of scary shit going on. When things are changing rapidly and the false promise of 20th century abundance looms large over them. When people are feeling exceptionally isolated and crave a sense of common community and purpose. And the potency of the old god seems to be waning a bit, a time when people are increasingly aware that there are extreme levels of injustice and wickedness in the world, but they just really aren't sure where to aim their blame. When people have this subconscious feeling that we're all hurtling towards some breaking point, a time when certain people might need a new, exciting messiah, someone that we might want to anoint with the title God Emperor of the United States. All hail the God Emperor, biggest daddy of them all, and he shall summon unto the earth a renewed era of justice, and Hillary and all of her Satan-worshipping pedo friends shall be thrust unto the righteous flames of judgment. So, who shall be our fearless leader, our fearless God Emperor in this time of fear and uncertainty? Shall it be some humble, Christ-like servant of the Lord, or perhaps a great and virtuous warrior who through unimaginable suffering has realized the truth of the universe, or maybe a righteous poet? This fucking guy? Seriously? Jesus. Alright. If you see something that you don't like, figure out why it's happening, what the ecosystem level conditions are that created it, and figure out how to correct it on the terms of the system. Integration forces you to deal with the reality on reality's terms. You can't just do the Republican thing and deny the existence of the problem, hoping that your righteous denial will make climate change go away. And you shouldn't retreat to live in an ideological fantasy land, hoping that you can tweet your way into a neo-Marxist revolution. Doing so just reinforces the delusion that you can live separately from the system and transcend the ecological dynamics that you don't like. But it doesn't work like that. We should all become less like self-professed prophets of rigid ideologies and more like all-embracing, all-forgiving, steamy, dreamy compost piles. See something that you don't like? Put it in the compost. Is there something about yourself that you don't like? Compost that shit. Process it. Make it a part of you. Find out all the ways that it is you. See yourself in it, because you are. Learn to love it for what it is and for what it could be. Learn from your enemies and turn your disagreements into fertile soil. Okay, I know what some of y'all might be thinking out there. What the hell is this kid talking about? Is he telling me that I should just forgive literal Nazis and accept what they're telling me based on some woo-woo belief that we're all compost or some wacky shit like that? No fucking way, dude. The only way to deal with Nazis is to smash them. Yeah, you're right. That is the way to deal with Nazis. Let's refer back to our Aldo Leopold quote from earlier.
A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise.
The biotic community in this context is the human community. Nazis, white supremacists, and other fascist ideologies, by definition, exist in order to disrupt the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. So, since we're building on our concepts here as first principles, if something is good for the land, then it's good for the people. Nazis, for example, are bad for the people. Therefore, they're also really bad for the land. The same thing goes for our relationship analogies. If an abusive relationship is built on lies and mistrust, then it is inherently working against this value of preserving the integrity, stability, and beauty of the community that is the relationship. Integration does not mean that everything should just be accepted at face value. That's not what compost does. Compost decomposes and neutralizes so that its elemental components can be returned to the land. And fascists and their climate-killing ilk need to be composted and neutralized by whatever means necessary.